Imagine a warrior from hell itself materializing upon the daemon world of Securus, where 8 burning moons hang in an unholy constellation. The air reeks of blood and incense as word-bearers space marines kneel before a shattered black altar, their crimson armor inscribed with blasphemous text that burns the eyes. Spawn rises among them, chains rattling with otherworldly power, his cape flowing like liquid darkness. The Chaos Warriors mistake him for a champion sent by their dark gods. But Spawn serves no master, not anymore. As a demon prince approaches, eyes burning with the power of the warp, Spawn feels his necroplasmic powers resonating with this universe's corruption in ways he never experienced before. The boundaries between realities grow thin. 2 hells now touch across the void. In a galaxy consumed by eternal war, where gods and demons wage endless battles for supremacy, what happens when a soul who has already defied one hell encounters the horrors of another? The warp storm howled like the screams of 1 trillion damned souls, tearing reality apart in violent crimson waves. Upon the daemon world of Sicarus, beneath 8 burning moons arranged in an unholy constellation, a circle of cultists knelt in supplication. Their flesh bore the marks of devotion, symbols carved into willing skin that pulsed with unnatural light. Blood ran in channels across the obsidian altar at the circle's centre, forming intricate patterns that spoke of summoning and binding. Wordbearers stood sentinel around the ritual site, their crimson power armour adorned with blasphemous scripture, bolters held across their chests in solemn reverence. Dark Apostle Marduk raised his Crozius, its head crackling with warp energy, as he intoned words in a language not meant for mortal tongues. "The veil weakens," he proclaimed, his voice carrying unnatural resonance across the blasted landscape. "The dark gods have chosen to bless us with a champion." The air split with a sound like tearing metal. Reality fractured, and from the wound poured energy that burned the eyes of mortal cultists, turning them to smouldering husks where they knelt. Even the Space Marines took involuntary steps backward, ceramite boots scraping against stone. What emerged was not what any had expected. A massive figure crashed onto the altar, shattering the ancient stone. Living darkness writhed around a humanoid form, chains rattling and coiling like sentient serpents. A tattered crimson cloak billowed despite the absence of wind. But it was the face that caused even the Dark Apostle to hesitate. A bone-white skull mask surrounded by a corona of greenish necroplasmic energy, eyes blazing with hellfire. Spawn rose from a crouch, chains lashing outward instinctively, impaling 2 cultists and flinging their bodies against the temple walls with sickening force. His mind reeled with confusion. This was not hell as he knew it, yet the stench of damnation hung in the air just the same. "What manner of champion are you?" Marduk demanded, aiming his Crozius at the newcomer. "Name yourself and the patron you serve." Spawn's laughter was a sound of broken glass and distant thunder. "I serve no one." His voice carried the weight of countless battles against the forces of both heaven and hell. Not anymore. The Dark Apostle's eyes narrowed behind his skull helm. "All serve the Pantheon in the end, whether willingly or not. You bear their mark. Their power flows through you." "Their power," Spawn growled, memories of Melibolia and his bargain flashing through his fractured mind. "But not their leash." Without warning, one of the word-bearers opened fire, a staccato burst of bolter rounds streaking toward the intruder. Spawn's reflexes were instantaneous, his living cape hardening into a shield that absorbed the mass-reactive shells. They detonated against the necroplasmic barrier, fragments ricocheting harmlessly away. In the next heartbeat, Spawn was moving. His body flowed across the chamber with preternatural speed, chains erupting from his form to entangle the Space Marine. Ceramite cracked under the supernatural pressure as Spawn lifted the warrior from the ground. "I came here seeking answers," Spawn snarled, bringing the struggling word-bearer close to his skull face. "Not worship, not servitude." The trapped Space Marine spat a litany of hatred. "The primordial truth cannot be denied. The gods will have your soul, one way or another." Spawn's grip tightened and the chains contracted with a sound of screeching metal. The word-bearer's armor imploded, crushing the enhanced transhuman within. Blood and viscera sprayed across the chamber as Spawn cast the remains aside. "My soul is already spoken for," Spawn said, turning to face the others. "And it was not your gods who claimed it." The remaining word-bearers formed a firing line, bolters raised. The Dark Apostle held up a gauntleted hand, staying their attack. Something about this being intrigued him. The warp energies surrounding the creature were unlike anything he had witnessed in 10,000 years of service to the Dark Gods. "You are not of this realm," Marduk observed, circling cautiously. "Yet the warp has delivered you to us. That alone speaks of purpose." Spawn's eyes narrowed, taking in his surroundings more carefully now. The temple architecture was unlike anything he had seen before. Massive vaulted ceilings inscribed with writings that seemed to move when viewed directly. Columns fashioned from materials that resembled bone yet gleamed like metal. Beyond the shattered walls lay a landscape of impossible geography, floating islands of rock, rivers of fire that flowed upward, and in the distance a mountain range that appeared to be breathing. "Where am I?" Spawn demanded. "Sicarus," replied the Dark Apostle with evident pride. "Holy world of the Wordbearer's Legion, blessed by the primordial truth. You stand in the shadow of the Templum Infio, where reality bends to the will of the gods." The name meant nothing to Spawn, but the nature of this place was all too familiar. He had walked the realms of hell itself, fought against demons and their lords. This place reeked of the same corruption. Yet there was something fundamentally different about it. The physics, the underlying rules that governed even supernatural realms, felt alien. Before Spawn could respond, a tremor passed through the temple. The remaining cultists prostrated themselves as a new presence made itself known. The air thickened with power, and a voice that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once filled the chamber. "What curious offering is this? Neither daemon nor mortal, yet bearing the touch of powers beyond." A figure coalesced from swirling warp energies, massive armoured in baroque plate that shifted between states of matter. 6 horns crowned a face that was both beautiful and terrible. Skin the colour of bruised flesh stretched over features too perfect to be natural. Great wings of iridescent feathers and leathery membrane unfurled behind the being, spanning the width of the temple chamber. The word-bearers immediately knelt, even the Dark Apostle bowing his head in deference. "Lord Cor Megron," Marduk intoned. "This champion emerged from the warp during our summoning ritual. He slew Brother Torvis without effort." The Daemon Prince's gaze fell upon Spawn, eyes like twin supernovas burning with malevolent intelligence. "I see the mark of a pact upon you, little wanderer," Coran said, his voice carrying unnatural harmonics that made the stone floor vibrate. "But not one sworn to the fore. How unprecedented." Spawn felt the weight of that gaze, attempting to pierce through his defences, probing at his essence. His necroplasmic armour roiled in response, chains rattling with agitation. He had faced demon lords before, had been betrayed by them, had fought and killed them. This creature, however powerful, would be no different. "I made a deal with the devil," Spawn replied, his stance widening subtly in preparation. It ended poorly for him. The Daemon Prince laughed, a sound that caused several cultists' ears to bleed. Such defiance, such potential. He extended a clawed hand. "Serve me, curious one, and I shall elevate you beyond your current limitations. Your powers are but a fraction of what they could be, if properly channeled through the warp." "I've heard that offer before." Spawn's chains coiled tighter around his form. "Never ends well for the one making it." The Daemon Prince's expression hardened. "Then perhaps you require demonstration rather than negotiation." With shocking speed, Cormigron lunged forward, a blade of crystallized warp energy materializing in his grasp. The strike would have bicketed a normal opponent, but Spawn was far from normal. His body twisted impossibly, the blade passing through after images of necroplasmic energy. Spawn countered, chains erupting outward in a deadly web. They struck the Daemon Prince with force that would have shattered adamantium. Yet Cor Megron merely staggered back, warp light flickering around him like a force field. "Impressive," the Daemon hissed, but futile. The chamber erupted into chaos as Coran unleashed his full might. The air itself seemed to burn with unnatural fire as he gestured, sending waves of mutating energy towards Spawn. The Hellspawn dodged and weaved, his cape becoming wings that carried him above the deadly assault. From above, Spawn unleashed his own attack, his hands transformed into wicked talons that ripped through the warp-saturated air, leaving tears in reality itself. The Daemon Prince parried with his crystal blade, each impact releasing shock waves that further damaged the ancient temple. The word-bearers had formed a perimeter, some firing their bolters at Spawn, while others chanted invocations to strengthen their demonic master. Spawn's body absorbed or regenerated from the impacts of bolt rounds, but each one drained his necroplasmic reserves. He knew from bitter experience that his power, while vast, was not infinite. Deciding to change tactics, Spawn plunged directly toward Khor Megan. The Daemon Prince raised his blade to impale the incoming adversary, but at the last moment, Spawn's body dissolved into a swarm of necroplasmic tendrils that engulfed the daemon like living smoke. A howl of rage echoed through the temple as Khor Megan thrashed within the deadly embrace. Spawn's consciousness surrounded the daemon, attempting to constrict and crush. For a moment it seemed the strategy might succeed, until the Daemon Prince's body erupted with warp lightning that blasted the necroplasmic tendrils apart. Spawn reformed several meters away, his armor noticeably thinned and damaged. The expenditure of power had been costly, and worse had yielded little result. The Daemon Prince appeared virtually unharmed, his laughter mocking. "Your powers are formidable but unrefined," Corran taunted. "In this realm, the warp flows through all things. It strengthens those who understand its nature and destroys those who resist." As if to demonstrate, the demon gestured toward the remaining cultists. Their bodies contorted in agony as warp energy poured into them, mutating their forms into grotesque abominations. Within seconds, a dozen writhing spawn creatures surrounded Khor Megan. Their misshapen limbs and gaping maws turned toward Spawn. "Behold true mastery," the Daemon Prince proclaimed. "These mortals give themselves willingly to transformation. Their reward is transcendence through suffering." The mutated cultists charged on too many limbs, acid and/or spraying from orifices that should not exist. Spawn met them with grim determination, chains and claws tearing through corrupted flesh. Each kill was messy but efficient, yet for each spawn destroyed, its essence seemed to flow back to Khor Megan, strengthening the Dawn Prince further. Spawn realized he was fighting at a disadvantage. This place operated by different rules than Earth or even the hell dimensions he had traversed. Here, death fed the very powers he opposed, creating a cycle he could not break through brute force alone. A new strategy was needed. As the last of the spawn creatures fell beneath his onslaught, Spawn suddenly charged toward the temple exit. The word-bearers opened fire, but he moved with impossible speed, his form becoming shadow-like as he slipped between their shots. "After him," Khor Megan commanded, rage evident in his voice. He must not escape the templum. Spawn burst into the alien landscape of Sicarus, his mind racing. He needed distance, needed time to assess this new reality and adapt. The rules had changed, but he had faced impossible odds before. Survival first, understanding second, vengeance would follow. Behind him, the hunt began. The hellscape of Sicarus stretched before Spawn like a wound in reality. He moved with preternatural speed across terrain that defied natural law. Rivers of molten souls that flowed in spirals, forests of crystallized screams where each branch captured a moment of agony, plains where the ground itself pulsed like a massive heart. His pursuers were relentless. Word-bearers on jump-packs soared through the crimson sky, while others piloted daemon-infused vehicles that churned the corrupted earth beneath spiked tracks. Chants and prayers to dark gods echoed across the landscape, carried by winds that whispered blasphemous secrets. Spawn pushed his abilities to their limit, his necroplasmic form shifting between states, sometimes solid enough to shatter rock formations as he passed, other times insubstantial, as smoke drifting through impossible geometries. Each transformation drained his power, but staying ahead of the hunting party took priority over conservation. After what seemed like hours of pursuit, Spawn found temporary sanctuary in the shadow of a colossal statue. The monument depicted a figure in ornate armor, holding a loft of book and mace, its features serene yet terrible in their perfection. At the base, smaller figures were carved in poses of worship or torment. The entire structure radiated a sense of wrong that transcended mere evil. This was a monument to the perversion of truth itself. Taking shelter within a crack in the statue's foundation, Spawn allowed himself a moment to recover. His living costume rippled around him, the damage sustained during his battle with Khor Megan slowly repairing itself. As the necroplasm regenerated, Spawn assessed what he had learned. This place Sicarus was saturated with energies similar yet distinct from the hellish dimensions he knew. The word-bearers were clearly superhuman. their bodies and weapons more powerful than ordinary mortals, and Khor Megron was something else entirely, a being of immense power bound to this realm in ways Spawn did not yet understand. Most concerning was how his own abilities interacted with this environment. The necroplasmic energy that composed his costume seemed to resonate with the surrounding warp power, sometimes amplifying his abilities, but at a greater cost. Each expenditure of power left him temporarily weakened, the regeneration process slower than normal. A sudden awareness prickled at the edges of his consciousness. Spawn peered out from his hiding place to see a procession moving across the blasted landscape below. Robed figures escorted massive containers on anti-gravity platforms, each container humming with contained energy. Word-bearers formed a protective perimeter, but these warriors bore different markings than his pursuers. Curious, Spawn extended his senses, allowing tendrils of his costume to creep closer to the procession. The containers radiated power, but of a different quality than the surrounding environment, something pure and terrible, like a sliver of frozen star. The sacristan's approach with the tithe. A voice spoke from directly behind Spawn. He whirled, chains instinctively lashing out toward the source. They passed through empty air, finding no purchase. A figure stood several paces away, translucent and shimmering like a mirage. It wore ancient-looking power armor of midnight blue, adorned with arcane sigils. Its helmet was fashioned in the likeness of a jackal-headed deity, eyes glowing within a light. Curious, the figure said, apparently unconcerned by Spawn's aggressive response. You are neither daemon nor warp entity, yet you bear the mark of infernal pacts. What are you? Spawn demanded, his chains coiling protectively around him. A seeker of knowledge, the figure replied. You may call me Nemsor. I serve the Thousand Suns Legion, or what remains of it. Another space marine, Spawn growled, recalling the term he'd heard among the word-bearers. Once, perhaps, there was a note of something like regret in Nemsor's voice. Now, I am but dust and memory bound by sorcery to continue the great work. Spawn remained weary, but sensed no immediate threat from this apparition. These containers, what do they contain? Blackstone, Nemsor replied. Harvested from the depths of Sicurus at great cost. The word-bearers use it in their rituals of binding to create stable conduits between real space and the warp. The term meant nothing to Spawn, but the concept was familiar enough. And why are you telling me this? The spectral figure's helmet tilted slightly. Because you are an anomaly, a variable unforeseen. Such variables hold particular interest to my master. I serve no master, Spawn replied reflexively. All pieces serve the board whether they acknowledge it or not. Nior gestured toward the procession below. These servants of the Corpse Emperor believe they fight against the inevitable, just as the word-bearers believe they serve the ultimate truth. Both are merely pawns in games beyond their comprehension. Before Spawn could respond, a klaxon wailed across the hellscape. The word-bearers escorting the Blackstone containers immediately formed defensive positions, weapons tracking toward the crimson sky. The storm breaks. Nior observed his form beginning to fade, a worthy test for one such as you. The spectral figure vanished completely as the first torpedoes struck the landscape. Massive explosions rocked the ground, sending shock waves that cracked the base of the statue where Spawn had taken refuge. Through gaps in the burning clouds above, he glimpsed the silhouettes of massive warships exchanging fire in low orbit. The word-bearers below were now engaged with new attackers, armoured warriors in midnight blue and gold, bearing the same emblem as Nemsor. They struck with precision and terrible sorcery, bolts of warp energy leaping from outstretched hands to emulate their targets. Spawn recognized an opportunity. With the word-bearers distracted by this new threat, he could slip away unnoticed, perhaps find answers elsewhere on this twisted world. Yet something gave him pause. The containers of Blackstone remained at the center of the battle, clearly valued by both sides. If this material could stabilize connections between dimensions, it might hold the key to his return home, or, if nothing else, provide leverage against Khor Megron should the Daemon Prince catch up to him. Decision made. Spawn launched himself from his hiding place, his cape transforming into vast bat-like wings that carried him toward the battlefield below. He struck like a meteor, chains lashing outward to clear a path through combatants from both sides. Word-bearers and Thousand Suns alike turned their weapons toward this new threat. But Spawn moved with supernatural speed. His necroplasmic armor absorbed the impacts of bolter rounds, while his chains tore through ceramite armor and flesh with equal ease. Reaching the nearest container, Spawn tore open its housing. Inside lay a crystal of absolute darkness, a void given physical form. As his hand approached it, he felt his necroplasmic energy react part of his costume recoiling from the stone, while another part seemed drawn to it. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Where his costume touched the black stone, the surrounding warp energies seemed to calm, creating a pocket of relative stability in the chaos of battle. Spawn felt his powers simultaneously dampened and focused, becoming less wild but more controlled. The abomination touches the null stone. A word-bearer sergeant shouted, "Stop him at all costs!" A thousand-sun sorcerer raised his staff, lightning arcing between its prongs. The variable attempts to remove itself from the equation. This cannot be permitted. Caught between two hostile forces, Spawn made his decision. He plunged his hand into the container and grasped the black stone directly. Pain lanced through his form as contradictory energies warded within him, but he held firm. The stone began to meld with his costume, black veins spreading across the necroplasmic material. As the transformation occurred, Spawn felt his connection to the surrounding warp energies change. Rather than being buffeted by them, he could now sense patterns within the chaos, currents that could be navigated or even harnessed. Both word-bearers and Thousand Suns converged on his position, momentarily setting aside their conflict to deal with the greater threat. Bolters roared and sorcerous flames erupted, but Spawn was already moving. With his newly integrated Blackstone, he found he could partially phase between the material realm and the warp, becoming neither fully present in either. Using this ability, he tore through the battlefield like a ghost, untouchable yet dealing devastating damage. Wordbearers fell before chains that seemed to materialize directly through their armor, while Thousand Sun sorcerers found their spells reflected back upon them by surfaces that rippled like disturbed water. As the battle reached its crescendo, a lot familiar and hated presence made itself known. The sky split open as Khor Megron descended on wings of fire and shadow. His demonic form now swollen with power absorbed from the carnage below. The champion reveals his true potential. The Daemon Prince's voice boomed across the battlefield as I knew he would. Spawn faced the approaching Daemon, the black stone integrated into his costume pulsing with contained energy. "I told you before, I'm no one's champion. Your denial is meaningless." Corran laughed, circling overhead. "The great game continues regardless of individual players' awareness. You have already chosen your role by taking the Null Stone." Before Spawn could respond, the Daemon Prince gestured, and reality itself seemed to fold around them. The battlefield, the combatants, the very landscape of Sicarus blurred and distorted, replaced by a chamber of impossible dimensions. Walls of flowing scripture surrounded them, words in languages never meant for mortal tongues that burned the mind to comprehend. "Behold the Scriptorum Infernal," Corran announced with perverse pride. Here, the word-bearers record the true history of the galaxy, untainted by imperial lies. The chamber was vast beyond reason, stretching in directions that should not exist. Countless word-bearers worked at pulpits of bone and brass, inscribing texts onto scrolls made from materials Spawn did not wish to identify. The air was thick with incense and the metallic tang of blood used as ink. At the centre stood a dais upon which rested an immense tome, its cover fashioned from what appeared to be flayed skin stretched over adamantine plates. The book lay open, pages turning of their own accord despite the absence of wind. "The Liber Demonic," the Daemon Prince said reverently. "Within its pages lie the true names and bindings of every daemon that serves the Pantheon, including my own." Spawn understood the implication immediately. This book represented power, the power to control beings like Khor Megron, perhaps even to banish them. If he could reach it, use it. "Your thoughts betray you, champion," the Daemon Prince sneered. "The book responds only to those who have given themselves fully to the primordial truth. Your divided nature, your clinging to what remains of your humanity makes you unworthy. We'll see about that," Spawn growled, launching himself toward the D's. Khor Megron intercepted him with blinding speed. The daemon's crystal blade clashing against chains hardened by necroplasmic energy and black stone. The impact sent shockwaves through the impossible chamber, knocking nearby word-bearers to the ground and causing the very air to ripple with disruptive energy. "You still do not understand," the Daemon Prince hissed, pressing his advantage. "This is my realm. Reality itself bends to my will here. As if to demonstrate, the floor beneath Spawn became liquid, attempting to engulf him in what felt like molten metal. Spawn's wings erupted from his back, lifting him above the deadly trap, only to find the very air solidifying around him, becoming crystalline bonds that restricted his movement. The Daemon Prince laughed, hovering before his trapped adversary. "I could destroy you now, but what a waste that would be. No, I think you require education before enlightenment." With a gesture, Corran summoned a sphere of swirling energy between his clawed hands. Within the sphere, images formed a planet of blue oceans and green continents. "Terra," the Daemon said, "birthworld of humanity. For 10,000 years the Corpse Emperor has sat upon the Golden Throne, a withered husk sustaining the Astronomicon that allows mankind's pitiful empire to function." The image shifted, showing a golden palace of impossible scale, and at its heart, a withered figure upon a massive mechanical throne, cables and tubes piercing desiccated flesh. "Your god?" Spawn asked, still struggling against his bonds. The Daemon Prince spat in contempt. "Not mine. The false emperor who betrayed his own sons and abandoned humanity's true potential. The Pantheon revealed the truth to Logar, who in turn enlightened the Wordbearer's Legion." The sphere showed new images, a magnificent figure in golden armor, towering over even the Space Marines. Then scenes of betrayal, war on a scale beyond imagining, brother turning against brother, across burning worlds. "The Horus Heresy," Cormacgrun continued, "when half the Emperor's own Space Marine legions turned against him, led by the greatest of his sons, though Horus fell, the seeds of ultimate victory were sown. For 10 millennia, the long war has continued, the Imperium slowly rotting from within, while the powers of the warp grow stronger. Spawn had seen enough. Using the black stone integrated into his costume, he focused his will against the crystalline bonds. They shattered with a sound like breaking glass, fragments dissolving into warp energy. Corgrun seemed unsurprised. "You learn quickly. Good. But learning and understanding are different matters entirely." The Daemon Prince dismissed the sphere and drew himself up to his full height. Warp energies coalescing around him like an aura of malevolent intent. "I offer you a choice, champion. Join us willingly. Add your strength to the Wordbearer's Legion. Your unique powers would make you a formidable dark apostle, spreading the primordial truth across stars yet untouched by revelation. And if I refuse," Spawn's chains coiled in anticipation, "then I take what I want by force." Cormacgrun's smile was terrible to behold. "Your will broken. Your powers bound to my service. Your consciousness trapped in eternal awareness of the acts committed by the body you once called your own." Spawn had heard such threats before from Malabulia and others who sought to use him as a weapon. Always they underestimated the strength of his defiance, the depth of his rage. "I've made deals with devils before," Spawn replied, his voice deadly calm. "Never again." With that declaration he attacked, not with chains or claws or brute strength, but with the black stone itself, focusing his will through the null stone, now integrated into his costume. Spawn projected a field of anti-warp energy directly at the Daemon Prince. Cormacgrun shrieked as the field touched him, his demonic form rippling like disturbed water. Parts of his magnificent armor seemed to flicker in and out of existence, revealing glimpses of a form too terrible for mortal comprehension beneath. "Impossible," the Daemon howled. No mere champion could wield the null stone with such precision. Spawn pressed his advantage, advancing step by step toward the dais and the Liberum. Wordbearers moved to intercept him, but found themselves caught between opposing forces as the Blackstone's disruption spread outward in a widening circle. Recovering quickly, Cormacgrun changed tactics. Instead of directly engaging Spawn, he gestured toward the massive tome. The book's pages began turning more rapidly, ancient bindings creaking with strain. "Zephon," the Daemon Prince called out. "Molo, Utbarden, I summon thee in the name of the dark gods." The chamber trembled as new entities began to materialize. Lesser demons pulled through the weakening barriers between dimensions. They emerged as nightmarish amalgamations of flesh, metal, and warp energy, each bearing a brand that pulsed in sync with the turning pages of the Libra demonic. Spawn found himself surrounded, the summoned demons circling wearily just beyond the range of his Blackstone disruption. They were testing the limits of his protection, probing for weaknesses. One lunge suddenly, a whip-like appendage lashing towards Spawn's face. His chains intercepted it, severing the limb with a spray of that hissed and bubbled where it struck the floor. The daemon shrieked in pain but did not retreat, its wound already regenerating. Another attacked from behind, claws raking across Spawn's back before he could fully turn. The necroplasmic armor tore but immediately began knitting itself back together. Spawn retaliated with a blast of hellfire that engulfed the creature, reducing it to smouldering residue. But for each demon he destroyed, another took its place. Summoned through the power of the Liber Monicum, Spawn realized he was fighting a losing battle. His energy reserves were depleting faster than they could regenerate, the constant drain of maintaining the Blackstone field taking its toll. A new strategy was needed. Ceasing his advance toward the dais, Spawn instead focused entirely on defense. He drew the Blackstone energy inward, creating a more concentrated field directly around himself. The Daemons immediately pressed closer, sensing the reduced range of his protection. A tactical retreat, Korgron mocked. How disappointing. Spawn ignored the taunt, conserving his strength. The demons circled ever tighter, their supernatural hunger evident in glowing eyes and gnashing teeth. When they finally attacked en masse, Spawn was ready. At the moment of contact, he released all the stored Blackstone energy in a single devastating pulse. The anti-warp explosion tore through the chamber like a tsunami, disrupting the very fabric of the demon realm. Lesser demons were banished instantly, their forms dissolving back into the warp. Charon was thrown against the far wall, his magnificent form temporarily diminished by the Blackstone's effects. The Liber Demonic itself slammed shut with a thunderous boom, pages smoking from the proximity to null energy. In the moment of confusion, Spawn made his move, not toward the book as Korgron might have expected, but toward one of the chamber's many exits, an archway of bleeding stone that pulsed with sickly light. "Stop him," the Daemon Prince commanded, his voice weaker than before. He must not reach the Nexus Infernace. Wordbearers moved to block Spawn's path, but he tore through them with renewed ferocity, chains and claws working in lethal harmony. His costume, though damaged from the extended battle, continued to regenerate, drawing energy from the warp itself in a perverse symbiosis. Breaking through the last line of defense, Spawn passed through the archway into a space that defied comprehension. It resembled a vast cathedral, but constructed according to principles that rejected Euclidean geometry. Pillars spiraled upward to vanishing points that should not exist, while stained glass windows depicted scenes that shifted and changed as if alive. At the centre stood a structure that resembled a wellspring, though what flowed from it was not water, but pure warp energy, a direct conduit to the immaterium that powered the Wordbearer's rituals throughout Cicerus. The Nexus Infernus came a familiar voice, the heart of the Wordbearer's power on Sicurus. Spawn turned to find the spectral form of Nemsor hovering nearby, the 1,000 Sun Sorcerer's translucent armor bearing fresh battle damage. "You again," Spawn growled. "Are you following me?" "Following, leading, observing," Nemsor replied cryptically. "All pieces move according to their nature." Spawn had no time for riddles. Behind him, he could hear the approaching forces of Khor Megan, the Daemon Prince, having recovered enough to organize pursuit. "What happens if I destroy this?" Spawn gestured toward the wellspring of warp energy. "Catastrophic destabilization," Nemsor answered. "A chain reaction that would tear Saccharis itself apart. Yet the black stone you have bonded with could contain the initial explosion. Channel it. Channel it where? Wherever you wish." The sorcerer's eyes glowed brighter. The conduit works in both directions. Understanding dawned on Spawn. This wellspring was not merely a source of power for the Wordbearers. It was a gateway connecting to the broader warp. With the right application of will and the black stone stabilizing properties, it could potentially open a path back to Earth, or to Hell itself. The choice was his. The decision crystallized in Spawn's mind as Khor Megron burst into the cathedral, his demonic form once again swollen with warp energy. Behind him came a phalanx of Wordbearers, their armor adorned with fresh sigils of protection against the Blackstone's effects. "Step away from the Nexus," the Daemon Prince commanded, his voice carrying the weight of infernal authority. "Its power is not for mortals to wield." "I stopped being mortal a long time ago," Spawn replied, chains erupting from his form to create a barrier between himself and his pursuers. With deliberate movements, he approached the wellspring, feeling the raw warp energy washing over him like a tide of madness. The necroplasmic costume reacted violently, tendrils whipping in all directions as conflicting energies battled for dominance. The black stone integrated into his form pulsed with increasing frequency, somehow maintaining a pocket of stability within the chaos. Khor Megron charged forward, crystal blade raised to strike. "Fool, you will destroy us all." "That's the idea," Spawn replied, plunging his hands directly into the flowing warp energy. The universe screamed. Reality buckled as conflicting forces collided at the heart of the Nexus Infernus. Spawn's necroplasmic energy, the integrated blackstone, and the raw power of the warp created a reaction never before witnessed in the long and terrible history of Sicarus. The Wellspy Springs flow reversed, then accelerated, becoming a vortex that pulled everything toward its center. Khor Megron dug his talons into the cathedral floor, leaving deep gouges in the ancient stone as he fought against the inexorable pull. Wordbearers were not so fortunate, their power armor offering insufficient protection, as they were dragged screaming into the maelstrom, bodies twisting and fragmenting as they crossed the threshold between realities. At the eye of the storm stood Spawn, his form radiating with power as he channeled the destructive energies. The Blackstone responded to his will, creating a framework that directed the chaotic forces rather than merely containing them. His cape billowed outward, becoming a swirling vortex that mirrored the larger cataclysm surrounding him. "What have you done?" Corrin roared over the deafening howl of reality tearing itself apart. "Changing the rules," Spawn answered, his voice somehow cutting through the cacophony. "You said it yourself. Reality bends to will in this place." The cathedral began to collapse, massive sections of the impossible architecture crumbling into the growing rift. The stained glass windows shattered, each fragment becoming a spinning blade of multitude death as they were pulled into the vortex. Throughout the daemon world of Securus, similar disruptions spread like a contagion as the carefully maintained balance of warp energies destabilized. Nor's spectral form observed from a distance, apparently unaffected by the gravitational forces tearing the cathedral apart. The variable introduces genuine chaos to a system built on controlled corruption. Fascinating. Spawn could feel his consciousness expanding as he maintained contact with the wellspring. Awareness stretching across dimensions. He glimpsed Earth as he remembered it, Hell as he knew it, but also countless other realms. The Imperium of Man with its million worlds, the Eye of Terror with its impossible physics, and stranger dimensions beyond. And he sensed something else. Attention. Ancient malevolent intelligences becoming aware of his intrusion, their vast consciousness turning toward this new anomaly in their domains, the dark gods of chaos stirring from their eternal games to investigate this unexpected player. "They see you now." Corrin laughed. Despite his precarious position, Kay, Sench, Nurgle, Slaanesh, the ruinous powers themselves take notice of your defiance. There is no escape from their gaze, no realm beyond their reach. Spawn knew the daemon spoke truth. These entities were different from the Hell Lords he had fought before, operating on a scale that transcended even his experience with cosmic powers. They were more akin to forces of nature than individual beings, personifications of humanity's darkest impulses multiplied across an entire galaxy. Yet he had defied gods before. He would do so again. With a final surge of will, Spawn completed the transformation of the Nexus Infernus. What had been a wellspring of warp energy became a directed portal, a bridge between dimensions attuned to the specific frequency of his own existence. "My soul may be damned," Spawn declared as the portal stabilized around him, "but my fate is my own." With a roar of thwarted rage, Khor Megron launched himself forward in a final desperate attack. The Daemon Prince crossed the disintegrating space between them in the blink of an eye. Crystal blade aimed at Spawn's heart. Chains erupted from Spawn's body, each link burning with emerald fire as they intercepted the blade. The weapons clashed with apocalyptic force, releasing a shockwave that accelerated the cathedral's destruction. Columns toppled, the ceiling collapsed, and the very foundations of the structure began to sink into a sea of rowing warp energy that had replaced the ground beneath. The combatants remained locked in their final struggle, neither willing to yield as reality crumbled around them. Spawn's necroplasmic armor was tearing away in strips, revealing the scarred and twisted flesh beneath. Yet still he held firm. Khor Megron's demonic form flickered between states of materiality, parts of him dissolving into the warp, only to reform seconds later in new and more terrible configurations. "Surrender to the inevitable," the Daemon Prince hissed, his face now inches from Spawn's skull mask. "The dark gods have marked you. Your soul now resonates with the warp. You cannot escape what you have become." "Watch me," Spawn replied, with a final surge of power that drained his necroplasmic reserves to dangerous levels. Spawn forced the Blackstone's null energy directly into Cormagron's form. The Daemon Prince's body convulsed as opposing forces war within him, warp energy and anti-warp material, creating microscopic rifts throughout his being. Cormagron screamed, a sound that transcended physical noise to become pure psychic agony, broadcasting across dimensions. His magnificent form began to unravel, not merely banished but fundamentally destabilized at the atomic level. "This is not defeat," the Daemon gasped as his essence scattered. "Merely transformation. We will meet again, champion, in darker dreams and darker realms." The Daemon Prince's physical form exploded in a burst of warp lightning and crystallized blood, the shockwave throwing Spawn backward into the reconfigured portal. As he fell through dimensions, the last thing he witnessed was the complete collapse of the Nexus Infernus, and with it, the Daemon world of Securus folding in upon itself like a bloated corpse sinking into quicksand. Then darkness claimed him. Consciousness returned slowly, painfully. Spawn found himself lying in a crater of scorched earth, the smell of burned stone and metal heavy in the air. His necroplasmic costume was severely depleted, barely covering his scarred form in tattered patches. The chains that were normally an extension of his will lay inert around him, temporarily drained of power. As awareness expanded beyond his immediate condition, Spawn took in his surroundings. The landscape was blasted and barren, reminiscent of a war zone. The sky above was choked with thick black clouds through which occasional flashes of distant explosions could be seen. The air carried the unmistakable scent of promethium, cordite, and death. Not Earth then, not hell either, somewhere else in this universe of perpetual war. With effort, Spawn rose to his feet, his costume slowly beginning to regenerate as it absorbed ambient energy. The Blackstone fragments remained integrated into the necroplasmic material, pulsing with a dull glow that seemed to repel the distant warp energies. "The champion survives," came a voice from behind him. As the pattern suggested, Spawn turned to find Nemzor standing at the crater's edge. The spectral sorcerer's form more substantial in this realm than it had been on Sicarus. Behind him stood a contingent of Thousand Sun Space Marines, their armour the same midnight blue adorned with arcane sigils, faceless helmets betraying no emotion. "Where am I?" Spawn demanded, his voice rough from the transition between dimensions. "The planet Mordian," Nemzor replied, "a fortified Imperial world on the edge of a warp storm. The Nexus portal scattered us across space and time when it collapsed." "Us? Not all who entered the vortex were destroyed." The sorcerer gestured to the horizon where columns of smoke rose from what appeared to be a distant city under siege. The Wordbearer's 34th host materialized 3 days ago, and immediately began their assault on the capital hive. The Morian Iron Guard fights valiantly, but without reinforcement they will fall within the week. Spawn absorbed this information, considering its implications. He had sought escape from Securus and the Wordbearers, yet now found himself on another battlefield, where the same enemies continued their crusade of corruption, and Cormagron banished, but not destroyed. Nemzor's tone carried something like reluctant admiration. Few beings have ever managed such a feat. The Daemon Prince will reform in the warp eventually, though the unique nature of his banishment may keep him imprisoned for centuries rather than the usual decades. A low rumble passed through the ground, followed by the distinctive shriek of artillery shells. The battle for Mordian continued unabated, heedless of their conversation. "Why are you telling me this?" Spawn asked, suspicion evident in his voice. "What do the Thousand Suns want from me?" "Want nothing so simple?" Neor replied. "My master, Axikaman, greatest of our Legion sorcerers, seeks to understand the tides of fate. You are a variable he did not foresee, a player introduced to the great game from outside its established parameters." "I'm not interested in your games," Spawn growled. "I want to return to my own reality." "And yet here you stand on a world you never knew existed, already caught in the currents of a war that has raged for 10 millennia. Neor observed, "The Blackstone you have bonded with could indeed open another portal with the right application of knowledge and power. knowledge the Thousand Suns possess in abundance. Spawn understood the implicit offer, aid in exchange for a potential way home. Yet experience had taught him to distrust such bargains, especially from beings that read of supernatural power and hidden agendas. Before he could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of engines overhead. Looking up, Spawn saw massive aircraft descending through the cloud layer gunships, bearing the iconography of Imperial Aquilus, their weapons already tracking toward the Thousand Suns' position. The Mordian 12th Airborne, Nemsor noted calmly, responding to reports of unidentified warp signatures in this sector. Your arrival did not go unnoticed. The lead gunship opened fire, heavy bolter rounds tearing into the earth around them. The Thousand Suns returned fire with disciplined volleys from their bolters and bursts of sorcerous energy that caused one aircraft to spiral away, trailing smoke. A choice presents itself, Nemsor said, seemingly unconcerned by the battle erupting around them. Alliance with the Thousand Suns who understand your nature and can aid your return. Or perhaps you prefer the Imperium of Man with its fear of the warp and hatred of all things touched by its influence. They would destroy you on sight if they understood what you truly are. As if to emphasize this point, a squad of Imperial troops in ornate carapace armor dropped from one of the gunships, deploying on jump packs to land in a perimeter around the crater. They carried an assortment of weapons, from standard las guns to more esoteric devices that hummed with power, specifically tuned to combat warp entities. Identify yourselves in the name of the God Emperor, their leader demanded through a Vox amplifier. This area is under quarantine by order of Inquisitor Karamazov. The Thousand Suns responded by opening fire, bolter shells impacting against the Imperial soldiers' armor. Warp-infused rounds bypassed physical protection to burn through flesh beneath, sending several troops crumpling to the ground in sprays of blood and viscera. Caught between these opposing forces, Spawn made a split-second decision. Neither side offered true alliance, only different forms of manipulation. The Thousand Suns would use him as a tool in their arcane plots, while the Imperium would see only a warp-tainted abomination to be purged. His path must remain his own. With a surge of will, Spawn commanded his regenerating costume to action. Chains lashed outward in all directions, creating a defensive perimeter that forced both Imperial troops and Thousand Suns to fall back. His cape transformed into massive wings once again, lifting him above the immediate battlefield. Your choice is noted, Neor called out, even as he directed sorcerous bolts toward the Imperial gunships. But remember, champion in the end, all serve a purpose in the great pattern, whether they acknowledge it or not. Spawn ignored the sorcerer's words, focusing instead on escape. The Blackstone integrated into his costume responded to his will, creating a field that disrupted targeting systems and warp-based tracking alike. Using this advantage, he soared away from the clash of Imperial and Chaos forces toward the embattled city on the horizon. Not to join the conflict, but to observe, to understand, to plan. This universe of eternal war was not his own, but it operated according to rules he was beginning to grasp. The Imperium, the forces of Chaos, the countless factions fighting across a million worlds, all pieces in a great game played by powers beyond mortal comprehension. He had defied such powers before, had broken free of male Bulgia's chains, had carved his own path through hell itself. This galaxy, for all its horror and scale, was just another battlefield upon which to assert his will. As Spawn approached the besieged capital hive of Morion, the full scope of the conflict below became apparent. Massive fortifications surrounded a city of impossible scale towers, reaching kilometers into the sky, connected by bridges and transit systems that resembled a metallic web. Millions of lights still burned within the structure, testament to the teeming billions who called this artificial mountain home. Surrounding the hive city were the forces of the Word-bearers, their artillery positions marked by regular flashes as they bombarded the outer walls. Demonic entities stalked among the Chaos Space Marines, their forms distorting reality around them. Cultists by the thousands swarmed forward in human wave attacks, fanatical devotion driving them towards certain death against the Imperial defences. Those defences were formidable. The Morian Iron Guard lived up to their reputation, holding the walls with disciplined volleys of lasgun fire that cut down waves of cultists. Massive defence cannons returned fire against the Word-bearers' positions, while squadrons of aircraft duelled in the smoke-filled sky above. Yet for all their discipline and valour, the defenders were slowly losing ground. Each hour saw another bastion fall, another defensive line pushed back toward the central hive. It was merely a matter of time before the outer walls were breached completely. Spawn descended toward a section of the battlefield where the fighting was thickest, drawn by an instinct he could not fully articulate. His costume had regenerated enough to restore most of his capabilities, the necroplasmic material once again responding fluidly to his will. The Blackstone fragments pulsed in time with his thoughts, their null energy providing a measure of protection against the warp energies saturating the battlefield. Landing atop a half-destroyed HAB block that offered a vantage point over the conflict below, Spawn observed a particularly desperate section of the battle. A company of Mordian Iron Guard was making a fighting retreat from an overrun bastion. Their blue and red uniforms stained with soot and blood, but their formation maintaining remarkable cohesion under fire. Pursuing them was a force of word-bearers led by a Dark Apostle, whose armor Spawn recognized Marduk, the same warrior who had been present during his arrival on Sycharis. The Dark Apostle wielded his Croesus with terrible effect, each blow reducing an Imperial soldier to a smear of blood and broken equipment. Fall back to checkpoint Sigma. The Morian commander ordered his voice carrying over the den of battle through sheer force of will. Maintain fire discipline, the Emperor protects. The Morians executed a textbook fighting withdrawal, alternate squads providing covering fire while others fell back to new positions. But their numbers were dwindling rapidly, and the checkpoint they sought to reach was still hundreds of meters behind their current position. They would not make it, Spawn realized. Not without intervention. It was not his war, not his world. These humans, with their fanatical devotion to their corpse god, meant nothing to him personally. Yet something in their desperate courage resonated with the part of him that had once been Al Simmons, the part that, despite everything, still remembered what it meant to fight for something beyond oneself. More pragmatically, the word-bearers were his enemies by choice and action. Cormagron might be temporarily banished, but his legion remained, spreading corruption across this world, as they had on countless others. If Spawn was to find his way home, disrupting their plans served his interests. Decision made, he launched himself from his perch, cape transforming into a gliding surface that carried him silently toward the battlefield below. He landed directly between the retreating Mordians and the advancing word-bearers, chains erupting outward in a deadly web that caught the front rank of Chaos Space Marines unprepared. Ceramite armor cracked under supernatural pressure as the chains constricted, pulverizing transhuman flesh and bone within. Blood sprayed in crimson arcs as Spawn tore through the word-bearers with methodical fury, each movement calculated for maximum destructive effect. The champion returns. Dark Apostle Marduk called out, his voice carrying unnatural resonance. The Dark Gods are not finished with you yet, it seems. They never learn, Spawn replied, chains reforming into razor-sharp blades that extended from his forearms. Neither do you. The Dark Apostle raised his cross-warp energy, crackling around the weapon, as he intoned a prayer in a language that caused nearby cultists to bleed from their eyes and ears. The air between them thickened with malevolent power that reached towards Spawn like grasping hands. The Blackstone integrated into Spawn's costume flared in response, creating a field of null energy that disrupted the sorceress attack. The opposing forces created a shockwave that rippled outward, knocking cultists from their feet and causing even the Chaos Space Marines to stagger. Taking advantage of the momentary disruption, Spawn charged forward, moving with supernatural speed directly toward Marduk. The Dark Apostle met his attack with surprising agility, Croesus sweeping in an arc that would have decapitated a normal opponent. Spawn was far from normal. His body flowed like liquid shadow around the strike, reforming behind the word-bearer to deliver a devastating counterblow. Chains wrapped around Marduk's weapon arm, while necroplasmic blades sought gaps in the ornate power armor. The Dark Apostle roared in pain and rage as one blade found purchase, piercing through a joint in his armor to sever tendons and arteries beneath. Warp-infused blood sprayed from the wound, sizzling where it contacted Spawn's necroplasmic form. "You think this body matters?" Marduk snarled, his free hand grabbing one of Spawn's chains and pulling with transhuman strength. "I have died 1,000 deaths in service to the Pantheon. Each one brings me closer to Apotheosis." With shocking speed, the Dark Apostle reversed their positions, using Spawn's own chain to swing him into the path of bolter fire from the supporting word-bearers. Mass-reactive shells detonated against Spawn's costume, tearing chunks of necroplasmic material away that slowly began to regenerate. The exchange had accomplished its primary purpose. However, the Mordian Iron Guard had used the distraction to reach their fallback position, establishing a new defensive line anchored by heavier weapons that now opened fire on the word-bearers. Heavy bolters and autok cannons cut down cultists by the dozens, while a pair of Lehman Russ battle tanks added their firepower to the barrage. Disengaging from Marduk, Spawn fell back toward the Imperial lines, chains lashing out to clear a path through the cultists attempting to surround him. The word-bearers pursued with disciplined fury, bolt pistols and combi weapons, spitting death at the retreating figure. As he neared the Imperial position, Spawn became aware of a new threat. The Morian defenders had trained their weapons on him as well, seeing only another warp-tainted entity to be destroyed. Las guns and stubbers tracked his movement, ready to open fire the moment he came within optimal range. "Hold fire on the mold." "Unknown," a commanding voice ordered. "Priority targets are the word-bearers for the Emperor." A figure stepped forward from the Imperial line, an officer judging by the ornate uniform and power sword he wielded. Unlike the other Morians, whose discipline could not fully mask their fear, this man's expression showed only calm determination as he assessed the battlefield. "You fought against the heretics," the officer observed as Spawn approached. "That makes you a temporary ally at best, a more complex enemy at worst. Which is it to be?" Before Spawn could respond, a shadow passed overhead. Looking up, he saw a massive spacecraft breaking through the cloud layer, a vessel of such scale that it dwarfed the gunships he'd seen earlier. Its hull was black as night, adorned with silver iconography that depicted skulls, eagles, and other imperial symbols. The Inquisition, the Mordian officer said, following Spawn's gaze, specifically the black ship Absolutus Diabolus. They detected warp anomalies consistent with forbidden technology or Xenos influence. "They're here for you," Spawn realized, recognizing the implication. These Inquisitors were this galaxy's equivalent of witch hunters, seekers of the corrupt and tainted. His very existence would register as an abomination to their senses. Among other things, the officer replied with grim certainty, "The word-bearers have been conducting rituals throughout their siege. The pattern suggests they seek to open a direct warp rift within the hive itself." A massive explosion from the direction of the inner city seemed to confirm this assessment. A pillar of unnatural fire rising from what appeared to be a central plaza. The flames shifted through colours that should not exist, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. "It begins," the officer said, something like resignation in his voice. The final phase of their assault, Spawn observed the spreading corruption, recognizing the similarities to what he had witnessed on Sicarus. The word-bearers were creating a controlled version of the same phenomenon he had unleashed by disrupting the Nexus Infernus. A direct connection to the warp that would allow demonic entities to manifest in far greater numbers than before. If they succeeded, Mordian would fall. Billions would die in ways that transcended mere physical death, their souls consumed by entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The planet itself would eventually become another daemon world, a staging ground for further corruption. More immediately relevant to Spawn's concerns, such a massive warp disruption would interact unpredictably with the Blackstone he had integrated into his costume. The Nullstone's properties might be overwhelmed, or worse, create a resonance that would draw the attention of the same dark gods whose notice he had attracted on Securus. His path became clear. "Where is the centre of their ritual?" Spawn asked the Mian officer. "The Grand Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant," the man replied without hesitation, something like hope kindling in his eyes. "The heart of our hive city now desecrated by their presence, but it's behind enemy lines through kilometers of contested territory." "Show me," Spawn demanded. The officer unclipped a data slate from his belt, quickly bringing up a holothic map of the hive city. He indicated a massive structure near the center, its architecture reminiscent of ancient Terra's great cathedrals, but on a scale that defied reason. "The word-bearers breached the cathedral 6 hours ago," the officer explained. "Our last Vox communication with the defenders reported Dark Apostle Marduk personally leading the desecration of the High Altar. Since then, nothing but screams and blasphemous chanting on all frequencies." Spawn studied the layout, noting defensive positions, transit routes, and potential paths of approach. The cathedral was indeed deep within enemy-controlled territory, but not unreachable for someone with his abilities. "I need something from your armory," Spawn said, a plan forming in his mind. Anything designed to disrupt warp energy, bombs, grenades, specialized weapons. The officer hesitated only briefly before nodding to an aide. "Bring the null charges from the special weapons locker. Authorization Kappa 97. Sir, those are inquisitorial property reserved for exactly this kind of situation." The officer cut him off. "I'll answer to Lord Karamazov personally if necessary. Now move." As the aide hurried to comply, Spawn turned his attention back to the battlefield. The word-bearers were regrouping, clearly preparing for another push toward the Imperial lines. Their casualties had been significant, but not enough to deter them from their ultimate goal. "You'll never reach the cathedral on foot," the Mordian officer observed. "Not even with your abilities." "Who said anything about going on foot?" Spawn replied. The aide returned, carrying a reinforced case marked with inquisitorial seals and warning runes. Opening it revealed a set of devices that resembled grenades, though their construction was far more complex than simple explosives. Each contained a core of what appeared to be blackstone surrounded by mechanisms designed to focus and amplify its null energy properties. Null charges, the officer explained, developed by the Ordo Malus specifically for closing warp rifts and disrupting demonic manifestations. Highly unstable and limited in supply, these 5 represent the entirety of our allocation for the defense of Mordian. Spawn took the devices, his costume adapting to create secure storage for them within his form. The blackstone fragments already integrated into his armor resonated with the null charges, creating a harmonic pattern that he sensed could be weaponized under the right circumstances. "What's your name?" Spawn asked the officer. "Colonel Vance Stubbs, commanding officer of the Mordian 12th Iron Guard," the man replied with formal precision. "And you are?" "Just call me Spawn," he answered, cape beginning to transform into its wing configuration. "If this works, you'll hold the line until Imperial reinforcements arrive. If it doesn't," he left the implication hanging. Colonel Stubbs nodded grimly. "The Iron Guard will stand until the last man falls. The Emperor protects." With no further words needed, Spawn launched himself skyward, wings carrying him above the battlefield toward the distant spires of the inner hive. Below, the fighting continued unabated, neither side aware that the true deciding factor of the battle now soared above them. As he flew deeper into the contested territory of the Hive City, the signs of corruption became increasingly evident. Entire districts had been transformed by warp influence buildings twisted into impossible shapes, streets flowing like liquid before resolidifying in new configurations, corpses reanimating to attack the living with mindless hunger. The word-bearers had established a series of linked ritual sites throughout the city, each one anchoring a portion of the greater working that centered on the Grand Cathedral. Dark apostles led ceremonies of mass sacrifice and blasphemous prayer, their voices carrying unnatural distances through the warp-thinned air. Spawn avoided direct confrontation where possible, his objective clear. The cathedral loomed ever larger as he approached, its once magnificent architecture now defiled with symbols of chaos and the flayed bodies of Imperial defenders arranged in patterns of dark significance. Great braziers burned with multicolored flames that consumed no fuel, while chanting cultists formed living conduits for warp energy that flowed toward the central altar. Landing on a shattered spire that overlooked the cathedral's main dome, Spawn assessed the situation. The null charges he carried would be sufficient to disrupt the ritual, but only if detonated at specific focal points. From his vantage point, he could identify 3 such locations: the high altar visible through the broken dome, a secondary shrine in what had once been the Baptististerium, and a tertiary focus in the catacombs beneath. To reach all 3 would require moving through the heart of the Word-Bearer's power, facing not only Chaos Space Marines, but also whatever demonic entities they had already managed to summon. A direct assault would be suicidal, even for one with Spawn's abilities. But subtlety had never been his strongest trait. Diving from the spire, Spawn plummeted toward the broken dome, chains extending to create grappling points that controlled his descent. He crashed through the remains of a stained glass window depicting the Emperor's ascension, showering the ritual space below with multicolored fragments. The scene that greeted him was a vision of hell made manifest. The vast cathedral interior had been transformed into a mockery of sacred space, its original imperial iconography defaced and replaced with symbols of the dark gods. The floor had been inscribed with a massive summoning circle, written in blood and molten metal, at the center of which stood the desecrated high altar. Upon that altar lay a figure Spawn recognized immediately, Dark Apostle Marduk, though not as he had last seen him. The Word-Bearer's armor had been removed, His transhuman body split open from throat to groin in a ritualistic manner that should have meant certain death. Yet he still lived, sustained by warp sorcery that kept his organs functioning despite their exposure to open air. Standing over Marduk was another word-bearer, this one wearing Terminator armor of such ancient design that it predated the Horus heresy itself. In one hand he held a ritual dagger fashioned from what appeared to be crystallized warp energy. In the other, a tome bound in human skin that he read from in a language that caused reality to ripple with each syllable. Corian Marduk gasped upon seeing Spawn's arrival, recognition and hatred burning in his eyes despite his ritual disembowelment. The champion returns. The Terminator-armoured figure looked up from his dark scripture, ancient eyes narrowing as they focused on Spawn. So this is the anomaly that disrupted the Nexus on Psychus, the variable that banished Core Megan. His voice carried the weight of 10 millennia of hatred and devotion. I am First Chaplain Koriran, right hand of the Primarch Logar, architect of the Horus heresy, and you have interfered with my legion for the last time. Spawn wasted no words on reply. His assessment of the situation confirmed what he had suspected: the ritual centered on Marduk's willing sacrifice, using a dark apostle's death to create a conduit for something far more powerful to manifest. The warp energies were already gathering, reality thinning as the barrier between dimensions weakened. Chains erupted from Spawn's form, targeting the ritual circle inscribed on the floor. The black stone in his costume flared as it contacted the warp-infused sigils, creating localized disruptions that sent cultists screaming as their connection to the Empyrean backfired through their nervous systems. Corian responded with shocking speed for one in such massive armor, the ritual dagger in his hand transforming into a force weapon that crackled with dark lightning. Restrain the intruder. The ascension cannot be interrupted. Wordbearers emerged from side chapels and aloves, bolters roaring as they converged on Spawn's position. Summoned demons manifested in bursts of warp fire, their forms shifting between states as they solidified in real space. Spawn fought with calculated fury, conserving energy while maximizing damage to the ritual components. Each movement served a dual purpose, avoiding enemy fire while positioning himself closer to the first target point for the null charges. His chains and necroplasmic blades carved through ceramite and demonic flesh alike, leaving destruction in their wake. Reaching the high altar, Spawn drove back a squad of word-bearers with a devastating area attack, chains whipping in a circular pattern that shredded armor and bone. With momentary space cleared, he planted the first null charge directly beneath Marduk's splayed form, activating its countdown sequence with a thought transmitted through his Blackstone connection. "Ignorant pawn," Corfran snarled, delivering a strike with his force weapon that Spawn barely avoided. "You think to stop the inevitable? The warp rift will open regardless of your interference. Marduk's sacrifice is but one component of a 1,000-fold working spanning a dozen worlds." The ancient word-bearer pressed his attack, each blow carrying force that could shatter stone. Spawn found himself on the defensive, his regenerative abilities taxed by the continuous combat. He needed to reach the secondary focal point, but Koriran blocked his path with implacable determination. A change in tactics was required. Spawn allowed the next blow to connect, the force weapon piercing his necroplasmic armor to strike the flesh beneath. Pain lanced through him, but he used the moment of connection to his advantage. Chains erupted from the wound itself, wrapping around the weapon and its wielder in a constrictor's embrace. Caught by surprise, Corian struggled against the binding chains as Spawn used the momentary advantage to break away, racing toward the Baptististerium where the second focal point awaited. Wordbearers attempted to intercept him, but he moved with supernatural speed, chains clearing a path through their ranks. The Baptististerium had been transformed into a blood pool in which cultists willingly drowned themselves, their dying essences feeding the ritual's power. Spawn planted the second null charge beneath the pool's surface, the device's activation, causing the blood to crystallize instantly as its warp-infused properties were neutralized. A massive explosion shook the cathedral as the first null charge detonated at the high altar. The blast was not physical, but metaphysical, a shockwave of anti-warp energy that disrupted the carefully constructed patterns of the ritual. Screams echoed throughout the vast space as cultists connected to that portion of the working had their souls forcibly severed from their bodies. Marduk's corpse, no longer sustained by warp energy, collapsed into rapid decomposition. 10,000 years of postponed mortality, claiming the Dark Apostle in seconds. Where his body had lain, a crater of null energy disrupted the flow of warp power, creating a dead zone in the ritual matrix. "Blasphemy!" Corian roared, breaking free of the chains with a surge of warp strength that sent ceramite fragments flying from his ancient Terminator armor. "You cannot comprehend what you interfere with. This ritual has been 10,000 years in preparation." The first chaplain raised his hands, chanting words in a language older than humanity itself. The very air seemed to catch fire around him as he channeled raw warp energy into a focused beam directed at Spawn. The attack struck with the force of a titan's fist, sending the Hellspawn crashing through multiple support columns before embedding him in the far wall of the cathedral. Spawn's necroplasmic costume was in tatters. Large portions burned away to reveal the scarred flesh beneath. The blackstone fragments embedded throughout his form pulsed erratically, struggling to maintain their null energy field against the overwhelming power of Kariran's sorcery. "I have walked the path of the long war since before your soul was even conceived," the ancient word-bearer proclaimed, advancing through the devastation toward his opponent. "I have communed with the primordial truth, received the blessings of the dark gods themselves. What are you compared to such glory? A misplaced spirit, a dimensional anomaly, nothing more." Spawn pulled himself from the crater his impact had created, his costume slowly regenerating as it drew energy from the surrounding environment. Despite the damage, he still had 3 null charges secured within his form, and the second charge was counting down to detonation. "I've heard speeches like yours before," Spawn replied, his voice a ragged growl. "From demons, from gods, from would-be masters of reality. They all end the same way." "And how is that?" Coriran asked, genuine curiosity mingling with his contempt. "Disappointed?" Spawn answered. The second null charge detonated in that moment, the Baptististerium exploding in a cascade of crystallized blood as anti-warp energy surged outward in an expanding sphere. The carefully balanced energies of the ritual destabilized further, creating cascading failures throughout the intricate pattern that the word-bearers had established. Corian staggered as the backlash struck him, his connection to the ritual momentarily disrupting his concentration. Spawn seized the opportunity, launching himself forward with renewed vigor. His chains struck with precision, targeting joints in the Terminator armor where ancient ceramite had begun to weaken after 10 millennia of warfare. The first chaplain countered with terrible skill, his force weapon moving with a speed that belied his massive armor and ancient frame. Each clash released shockwaves of opposing energies, warp sorcery against necroplasmic power reinforced by blackstone resonance. "You delay the inevitable," Corin snarled between strikes. "Even now the final components align. The word-bearers on a dozen worlds complete their portions of the grand design. Psychus may be lost, but the Legion endures. The primordial truth cannot be denied." Spawn realized the ancient warrior spoke truth. He could feel the warp energies continuing to build despite the disruption to the local ritual components. Whatever grand working the word-bearers had set in motion, it transcended the boundaries of a single planet or ceremony. This was merely one node in a galaxy-spanning effort, but nodes could be severed. Disengaging from the melee with core Firon Spawn focused his will through the black stone integrated into his costume. The null energy created a temporary shield that allowed him to break away racing toward the cathedral's crypt entrance, where the third focal point awaited. Word-bearers moved to intercept, but the ongoing disruption to the ritual had created chaos throughout the cathedral. Summoned demons. Their connection to the warp, destabilized by the null charges, turned on their summoners in mindless rage. Cultists collapsed as their augmented bodies failed, warp mutations accelerating beyond control. Descending the grand staircase into the cathedral crypts, Spawn found the third focal point, a chamber that had once housed the remains of Imperial saints, now defiled beyond recognition. The sarcophagi had been arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, each one containing not holy remains but the essence of a bound daemon, their immaterial forms compressed into crystalline structures that pulsed with captive warp energy. At the center of this arrangement stood a device of such technological heresy that it defied easy categorization. Part machine, part organic matter, part warp construct. It resembled a beacon or transmitter. Though what signals it sent or received remained unclear, without hesitation, Spawn placed his third null charge directly on the device, setting its countdown to minimal delay. Then he began positioning the fourth and fifth charges at opposite ends of the crypt, creating a triangulation pattern that would maximize the disruptive effect. He had just armed the final charge when the temperature in the crypt plummeted. Frost formed instantly on every surface, and the air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent presence. Spawn turned to find Cor Ferren standing at the entrance to the chamber. But the ancient word-bearer was changed. His Terminator armor had partially merged with his flesh, warp energy flowing through the seams like blood through veins. His eyes burned with internal fire that cast shadows in directions that should not exist. Enough. Corey Ferreron's voice resonated on multiple frequencies simultaneously. The Pantheon grows impatient with your interference, champion. Your soul bears their mark whether you acknowledge it or not. You belong to them already. I belong to no one, Spawn replied, chains coiling in preparation. The first chaplain raised his force weapon, which had transformed into something far more terrible, a living shard of the warp itself, crystallized into a blade that sang with the voices of imprisoned souls. Then witness true belonging, Corforonind. The device at the center of the crypt activated despite the null charge attached to it, its mechanisms overriding the Blackstone's disruptive properties through sheer power. The bound demons within the sarcophagi screamed as one as their essence was forcibly channeled into the transmitter, creating a focused beam of pure warp energy that tore open the fabric of reality itself. The resulting portal was unlike the chaotic rift Spawn had created on Sicarus. This was a controlled, stable aperture between dimensions, its edges defined by geometrically perfect boundaries that seemed to have been calculated to mathematical precision. Through this portal emerged a figure that caused even Cor Ferren to kneel in reverence. Clad in armor of such intricate design that it resembled a mobile cathedral more than battle plate, the being stood twice the height of a space marine. His face was a study in perfect symmetry, beautiful yet terrible in its inhuman perfection. A crown of horns adorned his head, and wings of golden feathers and shadow spread from his back in impossible contradiction. "Lorgar," Corran whispered, head bowed low. "My Primarch, my lord, your faithful servant, has prepared the way as promised." The being's gaze fell upon the kneeling word-bearer, acknowledgement rather than affection in those ancient eyes that had witnessed the birth of gods and the fall of empires. First chaplain, Logar's voice was melody and thunder combined, each syllable carrying the weight of 10,000 years of contemplation. "You have served with expected devotion." The Daemon Primarch's attention shifted to Spawn, who stood defiant despite the overwhelming presence before him. The null charges continued their countdown, seconds ticking away toward detonation. A curious addition to the equation, Logar observed, studying Spawn with the detached interest of a being who had transcended mortal concerns eons ago. Neither of this universe, nor fully aligned with any we recognize. Your soul bears the touch of powers that resemble our pantheon, yet are distinct, fascinating. Spawn said nothing, conserving his strength for what would come. The proximity of the Daemon Primarch was already affecting his necroplasmic costume, causing it to roil and shift as conflicting energies battled for dominance. The Blackstone fragments burned like cold fire against his form, their null energy the only thing preventing total destabilization. "Your interference with my legion's activities has created ripples in the great pattern," Logar continued, descending from the portal with steps that seemed to compress time and space around him. "Sicarus lost, Cor Megron banished, ritual nodes disrupted across 3 sectors. Such effectiveness from a single variable suggests purpose rather than chance. I make my own purpose," Spawn finally responded, his voice steady despite the overwhelming presence before him. Logar smiled, an expression that contained no warmth. "As did I once, before understanding that all purpose is ultimately illusory, all choice merely the predetermined dance of atoms in patterns beyond mortal comprehension." The Daemon Primarch gestured, and reality itself seemed to bend around his hand. "The ritual continues despite your interference. The great confluence approaches. The Emperor's light fades with each passing century. While the primordial truth grows stronger, the Long War reaches its final phase." Behind Logar, the portal began to expand, its boundaries pushing outward as more warp energy poured through from the other side. Glimpses of an impossible realm could be seen, a dimension where the laws of physics were merely suggestions, where thought and matter were interchangeable, where gods walked in physical form among their worshippers. "Behold the future," Logar proclaimed, arms spread wide, "not merely of Mordian, or even this paltry Imperium, but of all reality, the warp and materium united at last under the dominion of the primordial truth." The first null charge in the crypt detonated in that moment, its anti-warp energy creating a sphere of absolute negation that consumed the nearest sarcophagi and their bound demons. The shockwave struck the expanding portal, causing its perfect boundaries to waver and distort. Logar's expression hardened, the first hint of concern crossing those perfect features. "You persist in your defiance despite witnessing transcendent glory." "Why?" "I've seen hell before," Spawn replied, chains lashing outward to wrap around the remaining null charges, pulling them toward his body. Wasn't impressed then either. The second and third charges detonated simultaneously, their combined effect magnified by proximity. The warp portal contracted violently, its edges becoming unstable as conflicting energies tore at its structure. Logar staggered back, his connection to the immaterium temporarily disrupted by the Blackstone's null field. Corian rose from his kneeling position, rage distorting his features. "You dare attack the Primarch? Your soul will burn for eternity for such blasphemy." The ancient word-bearer charged forward, force weapon raised for a killing blow. Spawn met the attack head-on, chains and necroplasmic blades clashing against warp-infused ceramite. The impact created a localized implosion that collapsed part of the crypt ceiling, massive stone blocks crashing down around the combatants. Logar observed the battle with analytical detachment, his superhuman mind already calculating adjustments to compensate for the disruption to the ritual. An impressive display, but ultimately meaningless. The null energy merely delays the inevitable confluence. Spawn knew the Daemon Primarch spoke truth. Even with all 5 null charges detonated, the effect would be temporary at best. The Wordbearer's galaxy-spanning ritual had too many redundancies, too many alternate pathways to completion. Disrupting this node would slow but not stop their grand design. Unless an idea formed in Spawn's mind, born of his experience on Sicarus and his growing understanding of how Blackstone interacted with his unique necroplasmic energy, the null charges alone were insufficient. But combined with his own abilities and the power already present in the ritual itself, a different outcome might be possible. Breaking away from his battle with Corferan, Spawn launched himself directly at the wavering portal. His costume transformed, the remaining Blackstone fragments aligning into a specific configuration that maximized their null energy output. The necroplasmic material flowed around them, creating channels that directed the power precisely. "Stop him," Logar commanded, recognizing the threat too late. Spawn reached the portal just as the 4th null charge detonated, its energy synchronizing with his own Blackstone configuration. Instead of merely disrupting the warp opening, he forced a reconfiguration of its underlying structure, changing its destination coordinates within the immaterium. "What have you done?" Logar demanded, his perfect features contorting with the first genuine emotion. Spawn had seen uncertainty. "Changing the rules," Spawn replied, echoing his words from Securus. The portal's energy signature shifted, its connection to the Wordbearer's ritual network severing as new parameters overwrote the original design. The aperture contracted, then expanded again with renewed vigor, but its destination was no longer the realm of chaos that Logar had emerged from. Through the reconfigured opening, a different landscape became visible, a realm of green fire and chains, of tormented souls and towering spires that resembled nothing in the Warhammer galaxy. Hell, as Spawn knew it, the domain of Malabulia and the other lords of the Eighth Circle. Impossible. Corferan breathed, recognizing that the ritual had been not merely disrupted but redirected. The coordinates were perfect, the calculations verified over millennia of preparation. "The multiverse is bigger than you think," Spawn responded, satisfaction evident in his voice. Logar's expression had changed from uncertainty to intense interest. "You have opened a gateway to a realm unknown to us, a dimension beyond the warp as we understand it." The Daemon Primarch took a step toward the altered portal, studying what lay beyond with the curiosity of a being whose existence was defined by the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. "This changes everything." The 5th and final null charge detonated, its energy synchronizing with the reconfigured portal. Instead of closing the aperture, this final release of anti-warp power stabilized it in its new configuration, creating a permanent bridge between realities. What happened next occurred with such speed that even Spawn's enhanced perceptions could barely track the sequence of events. From the hell dimension visible through the portal emerged a massive figure wreathed in emerald fire, chains extending from its form to wrap around Logar before the Daemon Primarch could react. Malebolgia Spawn recognized his former master with a mixture of hatred and grim satisfaction. The Lord of the Eighth Circle of Hell regarded the captured Primarch with predatory interest, his massive form dwarfing even Logar's transhuman stature. Such power! Malebolgia's voice rumbled like an avalanche of skulls. Such potential! A fine addition to my legions. Logar struggled against the binding chains with all his considerable might, warp energy flaring around him as he called upon the power of his dark gods. "Release me, creature. You know not whom you challenge. I am Logar Aurelian, Daemon Primarch of Chaos Undivided, favoured of the Pantheon. Your gods hold no dominion in my realm," Malebolgia replied with terrible amusement. "And now, neither do you." With a savage pull, the Hell Lord dragged La through the portal, the Daemon Primarch's screams echoing across dimensions as he was torn from his connection to the Chaos Gods and pulled into a realm where different rules applied, different powers held sway. Corian howled in despair, charging toward the portal in a desperate attempt to follow his Primarch. "My lord, I come, your faithful servant follows." Before the ancient word-bearer could reach the gateway, Spawn intercepted him, chains wrapping around the massive Terminator armor to halt his advance. "Your master has a new assignment," Spawn said, his voice carrying a hint of dark humor. "I wouldn't recommend following. Unhand me, abomination." Corian raged, his force weapon striking against Spawn's restraining chains with apocalyptic force. 10,000 years of devotion, 10,000 years of preparation. The ritual cannot fail. "It already has," Spawn replied, tightening his grip on the struggling word-bearer. Through the still-open portal, Malebolgia's massive face reappeared, burning eyes fixing on Spawn with recognition and hatred. "Simmons, my wayward general, you think to use me as a weapon against your new enemies?" "Just introducing new playmates," Spawn answered, maintaining his hold on Coriran. "Thought you might appreciate the variety." The Hell Lord's laughter was the sound of 1,000 souls in torment, always the tactician. "Perhaps there is yet hope for your return to my service." His gaze shifted to Coriran. "This one's devotion is impressive. Such faith, even when misplaced, has value in my domain." "He's all yours," Spawn said, suddenly releasing the first chaplain. Caught off guard by the unexpected freedom, Coriran stumbled forward directly into the reach of Malebolgia's extending chains. The ancient word-bearer had just enough time to realize his error before he too was dragged screaming into the hell dimension. The portal remained open, a permanent bridge now between realities that had never before connected. From the depths of the immaterium, Spawn sensed the first stirrings of awareness, as the Chaos Gods themselves noticed this unprecedented intrusion into their domain. From the hell dimension, similar ripples of attention, as Malebolgia's rival lords detected the new source of power and souls made available to them. Two pantheons of evil becoming aware of each other for the first time. "Let them fight," Spawn murmured, satisfaction in his voice as he turned away from the portal. The disruption to the word-bearer's ritual had spread throughout the Hive City. Without Logar's presence to stabilize the warp energies, and with their primary architects now dragged into a hell dimension beyond their experience, the carefully constructed patterns collapsed into chaotic dissolution. Daemons already summoned found their connections to their masters severed, becoming feral entities that attacked anything within reach, including their former summoners. Word-bearers fighting throughout the city suddenly found themselves without the warp blessings that had enhanced their capabilities, their armor and weapons reverting to mere physical objects rather than warp-infused instruments of destruction. Spawn made his way back through the devastated cathedral, stepping over the bodies of fallen cultists and word-bearers alike. The grand ritual chamber was in ruins, the desecrated altar shattered, the summoning circles broken beyond repair. Outside, the siege of Mordian continued, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Imperial forces, sensing the sudden weakness in their enemies, launched counterattacks across multiple sectors. The inquisitorial black ship hovering in low orbit unleashed weapons specifically designed to combat warp entities, further disrupting the remaining Chaos forces. Colonel Stubbs and his Mordian Iron Guard had held their position as promised, and now led the spearhead that cut deep into formerly Wordbearer-controlled territory. Spawn observed their advance from atop a shattered spire, watching as the organised resistance of the Chaos forces crumbled into disarray. An impressive outcome, came a familiar voice. Nemsa's spectral form materialised beside Spawn, the Thousand Suns sorcerer's ghostly armour bearing fresh damage that suggested he too had been involved in the fighting. "Your legion wasn't much help," Spawn observed. "We observe and record far more often than we intervene directly," Nemsa replied without apology. "The great ocean of the warp teaches patience to those who would navigate its currents." Spawn had no interest in the sorcerer's metaphysical musings, the portal in the crypt. "It's stable, permanent." "Indeed," Nemsa agreed. "A direct connection to a dimension that exists outside our understanding of the immaterium. The implications are significant." "Two hells meeting for the first time," Spawn said. "Neither will be the same afterward." The sorcerer's spectral eyes gleamed with intellectual curiosity. "The dark gods will not ignore this intrusion into their domain. Nor, I suspect, will these hell lords you speak of tolerate the presence of rival powers. Conflict is inevitable." "That was the idea," Spawn replied. "Let them fight each other. Might buy this galaxy sometime." Nemsor studied him with renewed interest. "You continue to confound prediction, champion. Your actions follow no pattern recognized by conventional prognostication. My master will be most intrigued." "Your master can stay intrigued from a distance," Spawn growled. "I've had enough of sorcerers and their games." The spectral figure inclined his head in acknowledgement. "As you wish. But know this. The door you have opened works in both directions. New entities will enter our reality, just as our denizens may enter yours. The great game expands to encompass new players, new stakes, new battlefields." With those cryptic words, Nemsa faded from view, leaving Spawn alone atop the ruined spire. Below, the battle for Mordian continued toward its inevitable conclusion. The Wordbearers, deprived of their leadership and warp support, fought with the desperate fury of the damned. But their defeat was now merely a matter of time. Spawn considered his options. The stable portal in the cathedral crypts represented a potential way home, a direct connection to the hell dimension he knew. From there, he might find a path back to Earth, back to his ongoing war against the forces that had manipulated his existence. Yet, he hesitated. The black stone integrated into his costume had granted him unprecedented control over his necroplasmic powers. In this reality, here he had found a purpose beyond mere survival or revenge, disrupting the plans of the dark gods and their servants, creating conflict between pantheons of evil that might divert their attention from the mortal realm. A choice lay before him. Return through the portal to continue his personal crusade, or remain in this galaxy of eternal war to wage a new campaign against the forces of chaos. As Imperial dropships descended toward the cathedral, bearing inquisitorial forces come to secure the site, Spawn made his decision. With a surge of will, his cape transformed into vast wings that carried him skyward away from the approaching Imperials and the remnants of the Wordbearers alike. There were other battlefields in this vast galaxy, other conflicts where his unique abilities might tip the balance. The Wordbearers' legion extended far beyond Mordian, and now they would be seeking vengeance for the loss of their primarch. The dark gods would not ignore his interference in their great game. Let them come. He had defied gods before. Soaring high above the war-torn Hive City, Spawn looked toward the stars, visible through gaps in the polluted atmosphere. A million worlds locked in eternal conflict, empires rising and falling, gods and demons playing their great games with mortal souls as pawns, not so different from the reality he had left behind. With a final glance toward the cathedral where two hells now met, Spawn turned away, wings carrying him toward the horizon and whatever new battles awaited. In the depths of the warp, ancient intelligences took notice. In the shadows between realities, new entities stirred with predatory interest. And in the endless war that consumed the galaxy, the game changed as a new player made his opening move. The war eternal continued, but now with Spawn in play, the rules had changed.